of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority.
No, Chair, there will be no apologies for absence.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2? And can I ask Assembly members if there are any other disclosable pecuniary interest to declare? Thank you. Then can we move to item 3? Can we confirm the minutes of the working group meeting held on the 3rd of October 2024?
Agreed.
Thank you. Then moving on to item 4. Let's move to the question and answer session in terms of the mayoral and assembly elections. I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests. We have with us Phil Thompson, Head of Research from the Electoral Commission, Melanie Davidson, Head of Support and Improvement, the Electoral Commission, Michaela Palise, Head of Policy, Electoral Commission, and then Peter Stanyon, Chief Exec, Association of Electoral Administrators. And joining us on Zoom, we have Ruth Law, Head of Communications and Engagement for the Electoral Integrity Programme from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Welcome, Ruth. We've got a number of questions. Some will be directed towards you by various members of the panel. If I can begin with my first question, which is to Peter. So, Peter, the Elections Act brought a number of changes to electoral administrators. What lessons are there for the future, and how government goes about these electoral changes? What do you think?
I think the biggest challenge that was faced, not just in London but across the whole of the country, was the amount of change that arrived over 2 electoral cycles, but for London 1 electoral cycle, because clearly the May before voter ID and accessibility provisions came in at the elections outside of London, but everything hit London in one fell swoop. I think there are a number of delays in rolling that legislation out, and I think it was inevitable there were going to be delays, because when you looked at the range of changes, I think you could probably argue there were 7 or 8 work streams that in themselves would have been a major project to deliver. But when you rolled them all together, ironically, most of the challenge was not necessarily introduced by voter ID, because that was the big ticket in town. It almost sold itself. The media were very interested in that, which was very helpful. I think a lot of it's the hidden change around the introduction of the online electoral registration portal, absent voting online, the pressure that was brought into the electoral registration side on the same teams delivering the election was felt very strongly in London, solely because of the amount of change at the same time. And I think we mustn't also forget that at the time it was being delivered in May, we were expecting a general election at some point. No one expected it when it did come as quickly as it did, but there was a lot of talk about would it be in May, and therefore a number of the issues around counts and that and what the pre-planning would be was sort of providing an overarch on what was actually being delivered. But it was the amount of change arriving in significantly together that caused the biggest challenge for administrators.
An incredible challenge, which from our side, we've already received evidence, but I suppose we'd like to thank you and your colleagues in delivering those elections against that background that you were working with. It was of course there were problems and challenges along the way, but it was a fantastic task. Well done. OK, let's move to the Electoral Commission. Why was the data collection on voter ID not a statutory requirement for the GLA elections, but was for the general election? Who would wish to answer?
I'll pick this one up if that's all right, and then if there are any specifics on the date, I'm sure Phil can jump in as well. So when the legislation was going through Parliament as part of the Elections Act, which introduced the requirement to show photo ID at the polling station, that legislation was quite clear that the data collection was going to take place at the first set of local elections where the requirement was going to be in force, and then the subsequent 2 general elections. So following the first introduction of voter ID across England at the local elections in 2023, we were quite clear in our post-poll recommendations in our report that there should continue to be that data collection at the May 2024 polls, because we felt that more evidence and more data was required, especially given the scales of elections, the scale of elections that took place in May 2024. Not just with the elections in London, but we had elections in Birmingham, we had elections across lots of combined authorities as well. And it was also going to be the first time that voter ID was introduced and was a requirement in Wales as well. However, despite making that recommendation, it wasn't the legislation. There wasn't any legislation passed which introduced that requirement for May 2024. Which means that in the end, it was a voluntary requirement. We worked across the electoral community to just make sure that administrators, election teams were supported in order to be able to undertake that data collection voluntarily, providing guidance and advice on how best to do that, as well as a template form for them to use to be able to collect that data, both at individual polling stations, but then also tallying that up.
Okay, so in terms of I think, again, the Electoral Commission has said somewhere that the voter ID for both May and July, that the figures are an underestimate, and the example for the May elections in London, there was information from about 25 to 33 boroughs. Is that what you've established?
Yes, in the end, for the May elections, we got data back from 25 of the boroughs. That's not necessarily to say that the other ones didn't collect it at all. Yeah. It may have been, well, we know that the timing of the general election, it then shifted everyone's attention on. So there may have been a few that did also do the collection, and it simply didn't come back to us in time. But yeah, our figures are based on 25. Okay.
And the implications of, maybe it's a question of, is the Electoral Commission concerned about the gap between the data gaps and the limitations in evaluating the policy between these two elections? Or how does that, or is that putting you on the spot too much?
No, that's fine. I think we were concerned, I think, ahead of the May 24 polls about what evidence we would have, because although we, as Michaela said, made a recommendation that people collect it, even if they didn't have to, we weren't sure whether people would, and it is quite a intensive process of data collection in every single polling station and then a collation process afterwards. So we weren't sure what we would get. I think in the end we got enough data that when we're producing certainly overall estimates, we can be pretty confident that that is a kind of representative sense of what happened, and certainly 25 boroughs across London, and it was a good mix of boroughs. I think what that tells us is probably accurate for the whole of London. So I think we weren't in the end concerned about what happened, but it was a slight concern beforehand.
Okay, I'm going to now bring in Assembly Member Ina Bukhari.
Thank you. And we're quite happy for you to choose who takes on question. And just to kind of go on from the previous question, will the Electoral Commission evaluation of voter ID in these elections look at demographics, particularly on age, ethnicity and gender and so on? Is that something part of your work that you'll be doing?
I think I'll kick this one off again and then possibly pass it over to you, Phil, for some of the specifics on the demographics. So what we did for the May 2024 elections, both in London and across England and Wales, as well as then the subsequent general election, was to continue to collect data both on voter ID, both at the polling station, but also through a large-scale public opinion survey, which really helped to supplement some of that information that was collected in the polling stations. Because as I'm sure everyone is aware, that is just part of the picture of the impact of voter ID. Those are just the people who have managed to turn up to the polling station, being aware that there was an election and there may have, and that they needed to go along to a polling station. But there may have been some people who may have become aware of the requirement to bring photo ID on the way to the polling station or before the election, and therefore may have had some kind of barrier before then. So I think it's really important for us to be able to supplement that local data with a wider picture of what the broader impact was, and that's what the public opinion survey helps us with, and that also then helps us dig into some of those demographic details, because that is not something that is something that polling station staff can collect on what is called the voter ID evaluation form and the tally sheets that they use to collect that data. So having some of those details is really important for us in terms of evaluation. And I think I will pass over to Phil, but just to say, one of the main findings in a recently published report on the impact of voter ID is that the policy does appear to have had an, I guess, unequal impact on some groups of people, and some of the people that you mentioned, so younger people, people from lower social grades, were more likely to have been affected by the policy. And I will pass over to Phil now.
I think the only things maybe worth adding are, so we know, as Michaela said, from some of the public opinion surveying, that some groups are less likely to be aware that they have to bring ID. So that is, in particular, young people, people from ethnic minority communities, and also people with a disability. People from lower social grade groups, so particularly sort of the C2DE group in comparison to ABC1s. And then we also know separately that some people are less likely to have ID. And that tends to be people with a disability and people who are unemployed in particular. And I think it's the mix of that awareness and ID ownership that then when we look at things in our public opinion survey about people that told us they didn't vote because of ID, which is a relatively small proportion of people, and that makes it quite difficult to drill into for some of these demographics. But we can then see some of those coming through in that data. In particular, the sort of C2DE social grade group really stands out as a group that was much more likely to say that they hadn't voted because of something to do with ID compared to ABC1s. In a way, it's easier to see something, I think, in relation to that group because they're a much bigger group in society than some of the other ones that we're trying to look at. But the data did suggest that there was impacts on others as well.
Thank you. We're going to move to Ruth, who's online. What measures will you be using to evaluate whether voter ID has been an effective policy?
First of all, sorry, thank you for having me online rather than me coming into London.
No problem.
To join you today. So thank you very much for that. So similar to the Electoral Commission, we'll be using the data collected in polling stations, which they published in their interim report in September there. So looking at the numbers of people who were turned away for having incorrect or having no ID, and the numbers that came back later and were able to successfully cast their vote. We'll also be, or we are already, carrying out public opinion surveys with citizens to understand the impact and dig down into the demographics, as Phil and Michaela set out quite eloquently there. And doing some qualitative research as well with administrators, with returning officers and electoral services managers and DROs to understand the impact of voter ID on elections teams as well. That evaluation is underway at the moment, and we're expecting to publish a report from that in probably spring next year. As part of that, we're also kind of carefully considering the findings from the Electoral Commission's report and from their full report, which will be published before the end of this year, and we'll respond to that in due course as well. We are also undertaking a review of the voter ID rules and in particular the list of accepted IDs at the moment, and that's part of the government's commitment to have a look at voter ID and understand better its impact on citizens before bringing forward kind of any firm proposals for any changes to voter ID. So that review is underway. We're having a look at the ID list already, and we yesterday laid a draft statutory instrument to introduce the veteran card to the list of accepted IDs as kind of a first step along the route to any amendments that are needed to the voter ID rules.
So just to clarify, you said that you're going to get this report done by this spring, and this is going to be available publicly, and you expect the government will be enacting on these changes?
So the evaluation is expected to be published by the spring. I cannot preempt what is in that report and what the findings of that evaluation may be, but I would expect that the government, yes, will be acting on the findings of that evaluation and bringing forward firm proposals for any amendments to voter ID following that.
And also on photographic and ID and on the question of acceptable ID, have you found that this is the current list of acceptable ID is equitable to voters?
It's the stuff we're looking at as part of the review. Ministers are keen to look at all aspects of the voter ID policy, including the full list of identifications, and to ensure accessibility of the policy for all voters.
Thank you. Now, I will go back to the Electoral Commission on the photographic IDs and reaching out to the people in groups who needed them. You've touched on this already. Is there any more that you feel that we should be making sure in terms of our recommendations to the government that we should be highlighting through what you found out as well in terms of IDs? Is there anything else that you want to add? Because then I can move on to our next set of questions on that, because if we're all clear on that, then and there's no Assembly members who want to add to those questions as well, are there? Okay, great.
Could I just interject there? Because I think one of the key points about the review that's taking place, we're aware, for example, that outside of London, Mersey travel card, similar to the Oyster card, is not on that list. So there are already identified forms of ID that are not on the list that need to be rectified. Ruth and colleagues are aware of that. I think one of the big factors that we need to be careful with as part of the review is not to end up with a list of 800 forms of ID, because we are dealing with volunteers in polling stations trying to ensure they're looking at the right ID and it's of a certain standard. So I think one of the areas that administrators have been very keen to see is part of that review is not just adding, it's about actually evaluating the effectiveness of everything. And I think the Commission's reports previously showed that driver's licences, I can't remember the other two, passports, and there was a third, bus passes, were the three that were primarily used in May of the previous year. It'll be very interesting to see what other ones are used within that list. So I think as part of that review, it's very important that we look at the whole round, bearing in mind that we're dealing with the volunteers in polling stations who will be the ones actually delivering that going forward. So it's a review from both ends of the spectrum, I think.
Can we just bring in Assembly Member Russell to follow on?
Tiny little follow on this. Just in terms of the review of voter ID, is one of the kind of things that you're looking at actually discontinuing that as a policy? Is that one of the options that is available to you in your review process, as in the amount of work and effort it takes for polling staff and everyone else, plus the ever-expanding list of acceptable IDs, because actually the current list doesn't provide access, doesn't enable it to be easy for everyone to vote. Is not continuing with it one of your options in the review?
So from our perspective as the Electoral Commission, and in terms of the recommendations that we've made around the review of voter ID, that is very much focused on improving the accessibility of the policy. It would be ultimately a matter for the government to decide whether or not to scrap the voter ID policy entirely. So I think from our perspective, and also building on what both Ruth and Peter were saying, I think from our perspective it's very much ensuring that the policy is as accessible as possible to all voters, but especially during, as part of the review that it seems the government is going to be conducting on this, really focusing on looking at forms of ID that will most help those who we know are less likely to have an existing accepted form of ID. So really looking at what the evidence is showing in terms of additional options to add to the list of ID. And in the report that we published last month, we made a couple of suggestions based on the data that we've been gathering across the now 3 sets of elections that have taken place with the voter ID policy. And that includes, for example, the job centre plus travel discount card, given the impact on unemployed people of the voter ID policy. But we've also recommended that the government should consider whether some of the application and issuing criteria are appropriate and proportionate. We know that one of the reasons why the 18-plus student Oyster card isn't on the current list of ID is because it has different application and issuing processes compared to, for example, the 60-plus travel card. So possibly considering whether those criteria continue and are appropriate and proportionate.
Thank you.
Let's go back to Assembly Member Bakari.
So moving on to accessibility in terms of disabled Londoners, older Londoners, deaf and blind Londoners. There was definitely some changes towards particularly deaf and blind Londoners. Ruth, does there need to be more effective communication to voters about the opportunity to request accessibility measures for the next 2028 elections?
I think it'll be interesting to see what the numbers look like in terms of awareness in the Electoral Commission's report later this year, with regards has the awareness of the disability, the accessibility measures, has it increased since 2023? You know, these things do take a wee while to bed in, and for voters to become aware of what is available to them. I know the Commission will speak about the work that they have done with charities and society organisations, their partnership working to help raise awareness. In government, we have an accessibility of elections working group where we work with disability charities and society organisations to look at these issues about how do we raise awareness, how do we support disabled people, not just with regard to the accessibility measures, but with regard to accessing voting as a whole. And where there's more work that needs to be done, then we will work with the Electoral Commission and with disability charities and CSOs as needed to help with that. But I think we do need to see what the the next set of numbers looks like to see if we are making improvements in this area.
And to the Electoral Commission, what do you think we should be doing in preparation for the 2028 elections in terms of accessibility for disabled Londoners? I think we do a lot of reach out to charities. We do a lot of committee meetings with disability groups. What more do you think we need to be doing just to make sure that we get it right?
I think absolutely, firstly, continuing with that engagement. We last year produced guidance for returning officers to support them with the new accessibility requirements. And as part of that, as part of the production of the guidance, we consulted widely across the electoral community, including members of the public, but also some of the key partner civil society organisations and charities that we work with. And I think one of the key themes that came out of that is they definitely are keen to be engaged much more, both with electoral administrators, with the Electoral Commission, and just actors across the spectrum. So I think really continuing that engagement while being conscious, I think, of the fact that some of these organisations are, for example, volunteer run, so there are the usual issues around capacity, resourcing, etc., but really continuing that. And as Ruth mentioned, we're also part of the Accessibility of Elections Working Group, and again, that is a really good way of bringing all of the actors operating in the space together to just try and understand how best to work together. I think there is also an element around sharing good practice. I think just anecdotally, based on some of the observations, a few of us were out in London at the election in May, and just seeing, for example, the QR ballot codes and some of the innovations that were trialled in London and across other parts of England and Wales at the May polls was just a really good example of how these changes, in terms of the flexibility that they offer to returning officers, can actually have a positive impact. And I think speaking to other local authorities and really sharing that practice is another key element of that. And just finally, I think there is obviously a comms perspective. Ruth referred to some of the work that we've been doing with partners and civil society organisations. Our voter engagement team and partnerships team have done so much work in terms of directly working with these charities in order to co-produce materials that will actually reach the people that we're hoping to reach, because obviously as the Commission we cannot reach absolutely everybody, especially given that some of these groups face compounding barriers to access to democracy and to participation more broadly. So we really worked with them to be able to produce tailored resources, including in accessible formats, so that they were as accessible as possible. And I think also working with the media, whether local or national, our comms teams, I know, worked with London Lex and some of their materials, so just continuing to co-produce on that side as well.
there wasn't any main concerns that came out from the last elections that you think that needs to be highlighted now in terms of recommendations?
I think in terms of our findings from May 2023, the primary recommendation that we made was around that increasing of awareness. I think there have been improvements since then, but based on the feedback that we've gathered so far, there is a bit of a mixed picture in terms of what the awareness levels were of some of these changes. So I would definitely highlight that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're now going to move to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. And we're going to be looking at the change in the system of voting for the Mayor of London. So this time around we went from a supplementary vote system, which is what Londoners voted for when the GLA was set up. And we went to a first-past-the-post system, and we heard in our last meeting the two main parties, field organisers, were very happy with first-past-the-post because it's a very simple two-horse race message, and they said it made their campaigning job easier. But I want to sort of find out, maybe first of all with Ruth, how will MHCLG be evaluating the impacts of the change in the mayoral voting system?
I'm actually not aware of any in-house analysis going on the impact of the change in voting system. It will be interesting to see any analysis that comes out of Electoral Commission or other sources, and we'll be having a look at that as and when it comes.
Thank you. So, Electoral Commission, how are you going to be evaluating the change in the mayoral voting system?
So I think the main thing that, or the main two things, I suppose, that we would be looking at is how it was received by voters, and that'll mainly be through our public opinion survey that happens after the poll, but also looking at some of the kind of relevant data, particularly on rejected ballots at the election. We know from the public opinion surveying, we asked people things like whether it was easy or difficult to complete their ballot paper. 97% of people told us it was easy. That's quite similar to what we found previously and what we find in other elections, even where you do have proportional systems, so STV in Scotland, local elections, for example. So it's usually the case that people aren't finding it too difficult to navigate the ballot paper. So I don't think now that it's first past the post in London, that sort of represented a big shift. On the rejected ballot side, they were much lower this time in 2024, so it was about 0.5%, I think, of ballots were rejected, and that compared in 2021 to about 4.3% of the first preference votes, which I suppose is
there was a problem with the layout of the ballot paper in that previous election, so it's probably worth comparing to a more previous election.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point. I think that it wasn't, that 4.3% wasn't sort of indicative of what happens under supplementary vote. I think in 2016 it was more like 1.9, and that's much more in line with, I think, the last time Scotland had local elections with STV, which is obviously a different system, but it's similarly asking people to do more on the ballot paper. I think they had 1.9% rejected as well, so that was very much in line. So yeah, I think that dropped to 0.5. We do commonly see that first past the post has lower levels of rejection just because people are being asked to do less on the ballot paper, so they're just less likely to make a mistake. But it's not a really significant difference. And in terms of that public opinion finding, we never had a significant proportion of people saying that they find it difficult to interact with the ballot paper when it was supplementary vote.
Mm-hmm. But are you doing more than just looking at more than the mechanics of how easy or difficult do people find it to vote using those two systems? Do you, because obviously you have a different, with the supplementary vote, you're able to express a more nuanced position in that you can choose your kind of first choice of what you'd like in an ideal world, and then a kind of more realistic, we know it's going to in the end come down to a race between these two options, and so you go for the one of those two that you like best or dislike least. So that's a sort of extra bit of nuance in the voting that Londoners are given or were given, and it's something that Londoners voted for overwhelmingly when our system was set up in London. So are you going to be making any evaluation of whether Londoners miss having that amount of nuance in their voting system?
So traditionally, the Commission hasn't taken a view on the voting systems as well as other things like the franchise, and we've more taken a view on if there are changes to those, then how was that implemented? And did people know enough about them? Was it done well? Mm-hmm. So I think we wouldn't particularly be looking at whether voters felt they had more choice or not under one voting system or another. One thing we do find in research where we ask voters about things like satisfaction with the process of voting or confidence in the election, and we give them a chance to tell us why they are not satisfied or not confident. We do have people that respond to that by referencing proportionality. They talk, there are a group of people who obviously want more proportionality in voting systems, so that comes through in those kind of findings, but we don't particularly take a view on the pros and cons of the voting system itself.
Of course, because that's a political decision. Thank you. Do you, so also to the Electoral Commission, do you, so you've given a bit of information about the sort of what Londoners' views are in terms of first past the post and supplementary vote, but can you just say where precisely you're getting that from? Is that from your public opinion surveys, or is there any other way that you're getting that information?
It's primarily through our public opinion survey. So we would, after every set of polls, we would carry out a public opinion survey. In this case, we had a survey across England and Wales, but particularly had a larger sample in London so that we could talk about London in particular. So most of our feedback on public views tends to come via that route. Where we have other views on particular issues, when we were talking about, say, accessibility earlier on, we do gather other views from through responses to particular surveys where it's kind of target groups. But if we're looking across the whole electorate, it tends to be a public opinion survey.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, let's move on to Assembly Member Garrett.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. I was about to interrupt and say I had a question, but you were leading your way inevitably towards that outcome. Just following on the change to the voting system, and I suppose particularly spoilt ballots. I think last time it was about 85,000 ballots that were not spoilt. I suppose that's not the right word. They were rejected for having too many vote, which is obviously an extremely high number of people. You put that against, say, about 1,500 people who attempted to vote and were turned away and didn't return as a result of the voter ID. I don't know whether you have a view on particularly those 85,000, the question of the Electoral Commission, because I suppose the concern I have about those 85,000 people, roughly, is that they think that they had voted. So unlike the people who were turned away at the polling station who know that they haven't voted and perhaps might be annoyed about it, but at least they have that clarity, the 85,000 some odd thought that they'd cast their vote and that their vote was being counted, but unbeknownst to them, they muddled up the boxes in some way. I saw lots of those myself at the count. I mean, is your view that is a particularly more serious problem because of the fact that there's a lack of visibility for the voter in terms of understanding what's happened with their vote? So they might tell you that they found it easy to vote in your survey. Unbeknownst to them, they're one of the 85,000 who got rejected because they put two crosses in the same column, effectively.
I'll kick off, but please jump in if there's anything from the research side of things. I think in terms of whether we would take a view or make an adjudication between the two, the answer is no on that. I guess in terms of the 85,000 spoiled ballots, I think there were some peculiarities of the 2021 elections in London, not least given the COVID context and some of the changes that were made in order to enable people, but especially campaigners and candidates, to be able to campaign in a way that was kind of respectful of the COVID restrictions and the public health situation. So, for example, some of the requirements in terms of deposits and subscribers had been lowered for that specific election, especially for the mayoral election in 2021, which led, as somebody alluded to earlier, to a very kind of specific design of the ballot paper for that election, which proved to be confusing for some voters. As you say, unfortunately, there is the issue that one may not have realised that you voted incorrectly, and that is why I think, from our perspective, the awareness-raising campaign that we can conduct in advance of each set of elections, where we support people in terms of both registering to vote but also understanding what will be required at the polling station and how they can vote. I think that would be really the key for us, so that kind of information and awareness raising work.
Okay, and forgive me, this is obviously relating to the previous election, but the problem that you allude to is that there were 2 columns of candidates against which there were 2 columns of boxes, and so people got muddled between that. So I don't know if that election, was there a recommendation that there should only ever be 1 column of candidates if we went back to that voting system? Because it seemed to me that was one of the fundamental problems.
That was the recommendation of the Election Review Committee last time.
And presumably that would be a recommendation that you would agree with.
I think from our perspective, the important thing is the intelligibility of the ballot paper and just preventing voter confusion.
Okay, thanks. So moving on to, well, I suppose sticking with the theme of voters' understanding, but moving away specifically from the voting system on the mayoral vote and thinking about the fact that obviously there's a mayoral election and an assembly election going on at the same time, and the assembly election consists of 2 ballot papers, and so in total voters are presented with 3 ballot papers. I don't know, it's a question of the Electoral Commission. Do you have research on how to communicate to voters the fact that you've got those 3 ballot papers which potentially have 3 different voting systems happening on them, and what lessons there would be for the Assembly in terms of communicating with voters about understanding that and making sure they cast their vote correctly?
I'm just going to kick off with some of our, I guess, awareness-raising work, but also working in partnership, again, across civil society organisations, but also charities, so that we can convey in the best way possible through tailored resources information about how to cast your ballot on polling day. And I think also the resources that are provided within the polling station in terms of displaying, for example, large copies of the ballot paper and those information resources that are there when one goes to the polling station and then enters the ballot box in terms of how to cast one's vote. And I think just being able to draw on the experience and co-produce resources with partners, so that, yeah, if we can, I guess, adapt some of our communications mechanisms, then, yeah, that is, I guess, a constant learning experience for us.
And just thinking about the sort of broader question of electing a mayor and then separately electing an assembly, do you have any research, and if so, how do you feed that back into the GLA in terms of communicating that distinction to people?
I don't think that we have research that would show anything significant on that, but I'm looking at Phil in case he's got more to add.
We don't have anything that is specific about the difference in London. I think in the research we have done, we've never found a particular issue with people not understanding that they were going to have different ballot papers or how to fill in one compared to the other. And I think that's also true when you look at turnout across the 2 elections, where it's quite similar and people do tend to fill in both ballot papers when they're given them. I think
3 ballot papers.
3 ballot papers, sorry. 2 contests. I think on your previous question, maybe more so about communication and the how you get things across to people. One of the things that we have talked to Scottish Parliament about, for example, in relation to the STV elections in Scotland, is looking at areas that have higher levels of rejection and then thinking about to what extent there is targeted work, whether that's awareness work or additional resources or anything that could be used in those areas where you want to try and reduce that rejection rate between, from one election to another. I think that's one other area that could be more done on.
Okay. You've actually sort of preempted what I was going to ask, which was about, for example, lessons from Scotland where you've got similar issues. I don't know whether, Peter, whether you have any thoughts on, how the ballot paper and the communication with electors can be to improve people's understanding, really, of how particularly the Assembly elections work, so people understand what they're voting on and how that vote will be counted.
I was just going back through my memory bank, because I used to work in Enfield, so I've got direct experience of delivering GLA elections, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was in 2004 or 2008 we had 2 ballot papers, where the Assembly ballot paper was 1 paper with the party list on one side and the individual constituency list on the other, and that caused far more confusion. That's why we've gone to those 3 papers. So I have no empirical evidence to give you as to why that is, but other than the fact that although it's 2 contests, I think administrators see it as 3 separate contests, which is much easier to manage going forwards. In terms of the difference between the mayor and the Assembly election, I think there's always a challenge to understand what the Assembly does, and that's a challenge for the GLA itself to understand holding mayor to account and the like, as we are here today. I think the experience from polling stations, and the only, again, statistical experience will be, one of the big things that is drummed home to polling station staff is to issue all 3 ballot papers to the elector before they vote, and then they can't hand them back. They've got to actually vote or put them in the box as unmarked papers. I don't know the stats, but I do not think that there's that many unmarked papers in comparison to mayor papers being actually... so people are making their choices on those individual papers. It comes back to what was talked about earlier about the communication and the need to make sure that outside of the election that you will receive the 3 ballot papers for 2 separate institutions effectively, and also then to make sure that the returning officers have the facilities to train their staff, so that because that is the main point of contact, the staff behind that desk, you have 3 ballot papers here, you have 1 vote on this, 1 vote on this, 1 vote on this, and they send them off, and they are there to deal with questions at the polling station. I don't think we should underestimate the effect that has compared to big budget advertising, whatever the case may well be. But it's really, really important that the staff understand what the difference is as much as the voters walking through that door. As I say, going back to my experience, I'm pretty certain there was one election where there was 2. The contest was on one, and it was, I wouldn't say it was chaos because that'd be too strong, but it was very difficult to try and explain. In the left-hand side, it's for your constituency, for the right-hand side, it's for your party list for the rest of London. So I think the ballot papers as they stand, although adding to cost, although adding to the amount of paper, although adding to the workloads in some respects, is the simplest way of being able to explain, well, you've got mayor constituency, which people can relate to, and then London-wide, which is the proportional element of that.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Assembly Member Russell.
Yeah, I just wanted to go a little bit further on the particularly the description of the London-wide. I think the point you make about polling staff being well trained in being able to explain that to people is actually something that we could possibly reflect in our report, because that's a really direct way of making sure that as many voters as possible have access to clear information. But I think one of the things that we've been kind of mulling and sort of worrying away at is how you describe the London-wide ballot, because you're not voting for a London-wide Assembly member, you are voting for the proportions of members on the overall 25-member Assembly. And it's kind of, yeah, I just wondered if anyone in front of us has any thoughts about how one could very clearly and simply explain that to Londoners in a way that makes it, that kind of shows how, that difference where when you're voting for a constituency member, you're voting between one candidate for different, one candidate of each of several different parties, whereas with the London-wide, you're giving an instruction that the Assembly will have this proportion of Party A and this proportion of Party B, C, D and E, and then the clever maths system of D'Hondt will work out, on that list of 11 candidates that each party submits, who actually gets those London-wide seats. And that's an incredibly complicated thing. And just if any of you have any thoughts or you've seen anything anywhere where people describe a system like that in a way that's very clear and simple to understand.
I'll go first. Simple answer is no. It's incredibly difficult to describe. I think the key, a lot of that can be done outside of the actual polling day itself, and I think that's where that explanation, simple description as to what this means. However, when it comes to a polling station, I think the actual fundamental message has to be that in every single polling station the same message is given. Yeah. It's very clear that staff are always instructed you cannot lead people down a certain political line, individual candidate line for example, so the language needs to be very careful in terms of what is being said, and that may be something where the Great London Returning Officer can liaise with the constituency returning officer about actually this is the wording that we need to be used to provide the simplest form. And I think from my experience, the Mayor sold itself. This is the Mayor paper. This is for your local constituency of Enfield and Haringey, and the rest of it is a party vote which will go across London. So you're trying to get it into very simple terms. But to answer the direct question, no, I don't know if that's the correct form of wording, but I'm not quite sure what that would be without spending half an hour with each individual elector explaining that through. So sorry for a less direct response to the question.
No, but thank you. Sort of all very, very helpful, and also getting that same messaging to every polling station is a useful reflection. Anyone else just want to have a go at describing it simply?
Probably not, but I think this is maybe kind of a more negative comment than anything, but I think one thing it is important to not do is try and do anything on the ballot paper, or try and do too much on the ballot paper itself. And that is certainly based on pieces of research we've done over the years around different things about designs of ballot papers, about including things like referendum ballot papers and how much you try and explain. And I think Peter said in his answer there that it's maybe not about polling day, or it's certainly about away from the polling station. And I think that probably is an important aspect of it, where the ballot paper sort of serves one function but can only do so much, and risks maybe becoming confusing the more information there is on it. And maybe it is more about these other resources and other means of communications. But sorry, that's not the most positive of answers in terms of giving something that can be done. It's more about something not to be done.
No, but it's helpful, the important... I mean, what you've done, all of you, is emphasise the importance of clear messaging before the election, so that there is a widespread understanding of what's going on. So that's definitely a sort of helpful direction. Thank you.
OK, we're now going to turn to the issues of harassment and intimidation of both candidates and possibly administrators as well. So let me begin. This question's to the Electoral Commission at the moment. Your research found serious candidate abuse in the May 24 elections. What do you know about those experiences of London candidates in these elections? Have you honed in on a regional basis?
Our research on this is we send out surveys to all candidates, or as many as we can reach after a set of elections, but they're entirely voluntary, and we try and encourage response and use various means to do that. For the May 24 elections, we simply didn't get enough responses really from people in London, so I think we had about 14 overall across the election. But having said that, it's not enough really for us to report and talk separately about them, although when we look at them, there's no real evidence that they are significantly different from what we see generally say across England and Wales in May 24, or subsequently what we've done for the general election. So I think we can talk about those general findings as probably broadly applicable to London, certainly in terms of overall levels and things like where the abuse was coming from, the type of abuse people were experiencing, that kind of thing.
And do we believe that, well, if we're basing it on perceptions, that it's much higher than it's normally been? I mean, I've been stood for elections since 1990, and at different times and locally there were different factors that led to abuse on the doorstep or abuse generally against candidates. But looking back, my own personal view is it's slightly higher. in terms of what was in the past. Social media may help with that. But if we're thinking of perceptions, is that where your agency is coming from in terms of across nationally about issues of intimidation and harassment?
Yes, I think it's really difficult to talk about trends and whether it's getting a lot worse or a little bit worse. But I think there's a couple of things. One is, I suppose, compared to elections in the 90s or before, just having the online route for people to experience things just introduces a new channel where they can have this kind of things directed at them. So I suppose from that point of view, there may be more of it. We also know, in particular, thinking about the general election this year, the particular events can cause higher levels of abuse and intimidation, maybe in particular areas or maybe across the piece. And that's certainly something that was coming through from the research that we did after the general election. So I think it is difficult to talk about that trend, but what we do see is pretty consistently high levels of concern among candidates, ranging, to be fair, from what they themselves describe as relatively minor instances that they don't welcome, but class as relatively minor, through to much more serious problems, although the much more serious problems are among a much smaller group of candidates.
Okay, thank you for that. If we can then go probably to the Electoral Commission as well, stay with Electoral Commission, then go to the Ministry. What do you think the GLA can do ahead of the 2028 to address issues such as harassment and intimidation? Either to put a block on it increasing in the future, or to see it that it is an issue and that we may need to think about it in its many forms. So let's begin with the Electoral Commission, and then we'll go to Ruth, if I may.
Yeah, I'll kick this one off. I think in terms of what the GLA can do, I think it's continuing to work with a range of partners across the sector. In our last two election reports, so May 2022 and 2023, we did flag abuse and intimidation as a serious concern and urged the wider community to really work together, because we don't think that any single actor, whether that's the Commission, whether that's the police, whether that's somebody else within the space, can really tackle this by themselves. Because I think, as you were just discussing with Phil now, one of the key elements of it is actually identifying and being able to understand what the causes of the problem are and how these manifest themselves. So I guess if I'm talking from a kind of a very basic level, ensuring that abuse and intimidation does not become normalised and that these experiences are shared would definitely be one of the key first steps. I think there is also a role in terms of just improving responses and protection, signposting, for example, to candidates and campaigners how they can report instances of abuse and intimidation, where they might be able to find additional resources and information. That being said, the onus cannot just fall on the candidates and campaigners themselves, who in some cases may be victims of abuse and intimidation. And then there is the kind of the wider point around strengthening deterrence towards intimidatory behaviour. There have been some changes, not least with the Elections Act, which introduced a new disqualification offence for those who are convicted of having intimidated somebody, and that can lead to somebody being banned from standing for office or holding elected office for a maximum period of 5 years, but also clarifying the offence of undue influence, so putting that on undue pressure. There is also just, I guess, a role for the police in this to continue to treat allegations of abuse and intimidation seriously, and we do lots of work with the police. They're one of our key stakeholder groups in terms of providing that guidance to officers and that training as well, just so that they can understand what is required of them within this ecosystem, and conversely publishing guidance that enables candidates themselves to recognise, because sometimes there is that kind of distinction that is slightly unclear, to recognise abuse and intimidation, and therefore being able to know and feel confident that they can report that. And then I do think there is a wider point for all of the actors within this space, but especially, I guess, candidates, parties themselves and campaigners, for really emphasising that abusive behaviour, toxic, negative political rhetoric are unacceptable, and so really fostering that healthy debate and understanding where that may veer into abusive and intimidatory behaviour.
Okay, if we can now go to Ruth, is there anything you wish to add to what we've just heard?
I think Michaela set that out really clearly, actually. A lot of it is about working with partners across the sector and beyond to do what we can and work in partnership to try our best to tackle this behaviour. We are working in government particularly closely. MHCLG is working particularly closely with the Home Office as well as with the Electoral Commission and with the police to have a look at what's happened in recent elections, to understand the behaviour and to understand kind of what we all need to do, kind of our individual roles and what we need to do as a whole to try and tackle that. And we're looking kind of as central government at if there are any further actions that we need to take, such as with strengthening those deterrents, which can help in this space.
Thank you. Peter, can we return to you? Because I think you've called for electoral administrators to be covered by legislation in the Elections Act that currently applies to candidates. What was the background to that, and why do you think it's necessary?
It's an unfortunate part of modern society that the abuse of given to public officials is raising any reception point or contact point with local authorities, but it gets quite focused during an election for obvious reasons. I think where we're at is that the teams who are trying to deliver the process are delivering the process within the parameters the law says. And often when there's a deadline, it's a yes or a no. And unfortunately, there are sectors of society who live in the Amazon culture of immediately you apply for something, 2 days later you get it, not 5, 10, 15 days, which is sometimes the way the structure works with elections. We were disappointed. We did make representations before the Elections Act was passed, saying that we feel electoral officials, returning officers, electoral registration and staff should be covered by the same banner, solely because it is evident there is greater abuse being given because of dissatisfaction with the process, not because it's not being delivered correctly, but it doesn't suit the modern way of living, I suppose, in some respects. I don't think that transpired into polling stations, and that was the major issue of concern, where I think it was recognised the staff on duty in the majority of cases. If your name's not on the list, you're not coming in. If you've not got the right ID, you're not able to go past this. That in some ways is easier to deal with. It's more the background applications to register, have you got the right ID? The more detailed conversations where a classic example, a parliamentary election would be postal voting overseas. There's no chance it will get out there and back in 11 days, and yet a lot of, rhetoric was given back to staff saying you're incompetent in what you're doing. So it's a difficult one to say what the answer would be, but we do feel that candidates are quite correctly being protected. Why would that not be extended to electoral officials who are actually key players in the same process going forward? So that's where I think I can speak on behalf of everybody in the electoral sector on that behalf.
Okay, thank you for that. Any further questions on this particular aspect? Okay, let's go to Assembly Member Garrett.
Hello, so we talked about some high-level stuff, so we're now down in the detail of how counts work and the logistics of these things. Perhaps if I can start with the Electoral Commission. What feedback did you have for the running the May 2024 elections we've just had that you would like to see carried over implemented rather for the 2028 GLA elections, in terms of detailed the running of the election, not the high-level stuff we've spoken about so far?
I'm afraid I'm going to kick off with the high-level stuff, and then maybe Mel, if you've got any of the detail. I think just to go back to a point I think that Peter actually made at the outset of this meeting, I think one of the key bits of feedback that we got from electoral administrators was, as Phil mentioned, after each set of elections we run a series of surveys, and we run those with electoral administrators as well as polling station staff themselves. And a key bit of feedback was just about the burden placed by all of those new, complex, interconnected changes that took place at the May 2024 elections. And this is something that we'd raised last year as one of the recommendations following the May 2023 elections, was to really make sure that electoral administrators and their teams had sufficient clarity around the legislation on time, as we say, the 6-month principle, the Gould principle of ensuring that everything is clear at least 6 months before it's required to be implemented or complied with. And in addition to that, just that clarity would then enable for appropriate resourcing as well, because across several sets of polls we do find that administrators struggle to recruit sufficient staff, sufficient experienced staff especially, so presiding officers. We did receive some anecdotal feedback, both in the run-up and after the May 2024 polls, where some experienced staff told us that all of the different changes had put them off wanting to put themselves forward to work at a polling station. There are also then issues about securing venues, again going back to some of the elements about not knowing when the general election was going to take place, and therefore having to prepare and put in place contingency mitigation plans, all of those things. So I think just having the broader perspective on this, I guess from our side, is that just going forward, urging that that clarity, and also just making sure that, I guess more broadly, that we have a system of electoral law that is simplified, consolidated, modernised, that makes it much easier then for administrators to actually run and deliver those polls. But yeah, that was my kind of opening, more high-level thing. I don't know if, Mel, you've got anything else to add?
I can certainly add a little bit more about the slightly more operational engagement that we had with both the GLRO and other returning officers across London during the actual delivery of the polls. So you're probably aware we set performance standards for returning officers, and they're all designed about making sure that the polls are really well run and that everyone can have confidence and faith in the response from an elector's perspective, a candidate's perspective. So we use those standards alongside our very detailed guidance to work with returning officers and their teams, and indeed with the GLRO and her team, to support the delivery of polls and to work alongside and understand the planning, the contingencies, everything that's put in place. And then we provide a sort of advice response, reactive response service where challenges come up. There's always, every election, there's always something new that you've never seen before, so they will come to us, ask for advice about how to deal with it, and we can provide that advice back to returning officers and their teams. So I can say, at an operational level, we work very closely with the GLRO and her team right the way through from their very early planning to being around and supporting in the lead up, coming to some of the briefings that she held, and hopefully providing some value and being able to support there for whoever was engaging with the process. And our observations, there's quite a few of us out and about in London on polling day, unsurprisingly, were that generally the poll was very well run. There were very few issues that we came across that were of concern to us. There's always little things that happen, but we are there and we're able to respond to them. But actually, generally, the poll and the process of the management of the verification and the count and everything was really well run, with as few issues as we would like to see.
So in terms of improvement for 2028, then, it sounds like, other than being clearer about questions that people had earlier on, and obviously the general election, it's not anyone in this room's gift. Well, we don't know. I mean, things can change in politics, can't they? But probably no one in this room it'll be in their gift to decide when the next general election is going to be. So that clash is obviously hanging over all of this. But in terms of specific recommendations for 2028, sounds like there were none. Is that? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
I mean, we would just like to keep working with the team here and with the other teams. And as you say, there's always a risk of another potential clash in 2028. We all hope that doesn't happen, but just keep working with us and so that we can support. And you never know what will come up, and we're very happy to keep in the loop with that and offer any support that we can.
Okay, I was actually going to come to this in a mo, but you mentioned, Michaela, sorry, about the legal bit. Is this to do with the mixing of ballots? Is that what you were alluding to? In that case, was it something else in that case? Do you mind elaborating on what that was?
Yeah, so I was just talking about legislative change in general and just making sure that that is done in a way that has, I guess, that is workable for electoral administrators, so that they have both sufficient time but also resources in terms of staff capacity, venue, etc., as well as funding in order to be able to deliver the polls. And I guess those legislative changes then would sit on top of the framework of electoral law that we find ourselves with, which I think both the AEA and the Electoral Commission have been calling for it to be modernised and kind of consolidated and simplified.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, did you have any thoughts, recommendations for what could be done better, differently in 2028?
In many respects, I think it's more of the same. I just jotted down some bits and pieces. I mean, I came into London just after the 2000 elections. There were 14 separate counts. There was the issues of green bays in counts, which stopped counts taking place. The chair smiling there, Riley, as he recalls those sort of instances. I was party to the first regional centre at the Alexandra Palace, which didn't take place till 2004, I think it was. And then we went to the 3 regional centres. Obviously, electronic counting, SV, that changed, and then the hand counting brought in a real challenge as to how you do that across the whole of London. Now, a lot of lessons were learnt from doing that. I think more can be learnt from seeing how the Police and Crime Commissioner elections are run in places like Thames Valley, huge areas in their own right, not on the scale, clearly, of London, but the fact that it leads on to the question I'm sure you're going to raise about the mixing of papers and the like. So I think very much, again, at the backdrop of the uncertainty and having to preempt the potential combined parliamentary and GLA, that did suck a lot of resource out in terms of the planning. I know there were lots of changes of count venues, the suitability of size. It's not bizarre to say it, but across London there aren't all the venues that you'd think there would be in the constituencies where you want them to be able to do the counts that would make life a lot easier. So I think the lessons learned in terms of that hand count, assuming we go first past the post again in 4 years' time, we just don't know what the government will do around it. But assuming that is the case, I think it will be going back to root and branch to actually see how that can be delivered, the comms between the GLRO and the constituent returning officers, ensuring that everyone knows where they are so that actually the members, the media can be aware of where we are on the progress, because in some respects it's a detrimental step going from e-counting to hand counting solely from the comms that was flowing through. I think actually hand counting and e-counting have both got their merits, but it's more the communications and where are we on the pathway, which was very, very positive, and the breakdown of results and all that after the election that is harder to do when you do it on the traditional hand way of doing that. So sorry, very waffly answer, but it's basically, it's always been a moving feast. We've just got to step back, work out where we are in the next round, and then if that's combined with a general, it's going to be a case of, well, how will that factor into it, and then deliver something that's actually safe, secure, trusted at the end of the day in whatever form it comes to.
You were pleased to know that the constituency returning officers who were at our previous meeting made their point very clearly about finding venues, especially at short notice, especially if you don't know if you've got a general and a GLA on the same day. They made their thoughts very clear. You mentioned mixing of ballots, so let's go on to that. Obviously, this is this business about, it matters because you can't then have ward-level results produced, and the law seems to be you must do it possibly when you have a manual count, and you don't need to do it when you have an electronic count. I suppose my question to you is was that clear, do you think, and was that your understanding? Was it clear? Should it be changed, the rule on that?
My understanding is that when the law was initially drafted, it was drafted on the basis of e-counting, so therefore the system was able to produce a lot more granular information than a hand count can do. The actual reading of the legislation mirrors what you would do at any other count, which is to mix ballot papers to avoid the challenge of secrecy and someone being able to identify someone's vote from a polling station. Now, clearly on the scale we're talking about, the likelihood of someone being able to identify an individual ballot paper is minimal, but the same principle applies. So in terms of it's the wrong word to say detrimental effect, it's more the outcome of the results. in the e-counting system, because the way it was set up, the results are easy to extrapolate in whatever format you wanted that without affecting secrecy. In a manual way of doing it, there will be the danger of that, and I think it's pretty consistent. There was my understanding, having spoken to a couple of colleagues in London, was it wasn't a consistent approach across the capital. But most, I believe, will have gone down the line of actually being able to produce ward results without the postal votes, and then the postal votes separately, which personally is the way I would do it in a parliamentary, in a local government, whatever the case may be. But it's because you can't break that down for postals going back to the thing, because that mix has to take place. You can't give separate results on that basis, whereas e-counting you could without affecting secrecy. So it's a balance between what's permissible and what's not.
Well, I think you've possibly answered my question, so let me just clarify I've understood what you said. So my question was going to be, so there's some disagreement that we've had about, put e-counting to one side for a moment, and if the next GLA election is manual count, is it logistically possible, forgetting the law and the whatnot, if it were done that way, would it be logistically possible, do you think, to produce ward-level results with a manual count?
It's an answer I can say yes, it would be logistically possible, but actually practically very, very difficult to do. Because what you'd have to do is to effectively have two separate counts taking place at your count, which would therefore then mean your postal count split into wards, into whatever the building block is that you're going down to, and then the same taking place on the polling station, which is easier to do because you've clearly got that coming from a polling station. So logistically it's possible. Whether it's a sensible thing to do in terms of electoral process, I would not be so sure, because it would go completely in the face of the secrecy provisions, and also the how that would roll out then for parliamentary elections for other regional-based ones going forward. So I think it's an area to tread carefully into, albeit it's very useful information for primarily political parties in terms of campaigning. And I wonder if part of this last time, I can't speak for yourselves obviously on that side, but knowing a general election was coming, there was a fever building in terms of to know what was happening in terms of voting patterns, that actually sort of fueled that slightly. And I believe a lack of coordination, a lack of understanding what everybody was doing across London, because at the end of the day, a CRO has the same sort of responsibility as the GLRO to actually say, I am liable for the result in my area, and therefore has to be satisfied they're not doubting that secrecy part of that. Again, sorry, a bit of a waffly answer, but I hope that helped.
It's probably worth adding, not to preempt what our next panel might say, but I think there are some academic researchers who like that data as well.
I'm sorry, okay, I should have added that to the list. Yeah.
They make those thoughts. So if I could just ask Ruth, just quickly on that same question about mixing ballots. So we heard evidence previously that this requirement to mix ballots at the manual count was described to us as a drafting error, so that it's not necessary at an e-count but is necessary at a manual count. Does MHCLG, have a view on that, and is that something that you're looking at, if it is a drafting error, to correct?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question, but what I can do is take it away and ask it of our policy colleagues and come back to you.
Thank you, I'd really appreciate that. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, we've reached the point where we've come to the end of our questioning. Is there anything that you wish to say to us that you think we've not covered in sufficient detail, or any issue? If I start with you, Ruth, is there anything else that in a closing submission that you want to say to us?
I don't think there's anything else that I need to add. Just again, thank you for having us along.
Peter?
I think it's alluding back to the earlier points that were made about the amount of change that took place over the last 2 years. I think it's really a plea, and the new government has come in and there's been no electoral bill in the first term, which is positive in many respects. I really think there needs to be let's just step back, get the foundations right, let's correct the errors or the anomalies that are in there before major changes then introduced on top of that, because I think Michaela made the point with regards to the consolidation of electoral law. We still await a formal response to the Law Commission's proposals to consolidate that electoral law across all types of jurisdictions, But I think at the moment the sector creaked incredibly leading into both elections of this year. A period of reflection would not go amiss. So if there's something that the Assembly is able to add to say, look, let's be sensible about going forwards, not trying to layer more and more on top of a system that has coped but can cope much longer. So I think that's the only point I would make.
Electoral Commission?
I'll say a few words. Firstly, just to thank you again for having us. I think from our perspective, as noted, I think in a letter that we shared with you, at the moment we're in the final stages of preparing our report on both the UK general election but also on the May polls. So that should be coming within the next month or so. We'll make sure that you all have copies of that. And that will include some key recommendations from our side for improvement around some of the specific areas that we identified at both sets of polls. And we will also be publishing, for example, some of the public opinion data alongside that as well. So there will be additional resource there. But I think just in addition to that, and just to echo what Peter was saying, I think from our perspective, we know that there are different manifesto commitments that were in the government's in the government's manifesto and are part of the legislative agenda. So really just continuing that engagement across the wider electoral community. I think we know that we worked really well with London Elects in the lead up to the May 2024 polls, and really just continuing that engagement across the sector.
Well, I'd like to thank the Electoral Commission for some of the joint work that you undertook with not just our staff but also with the London boroughs. And I think that always adds to the quality of our work. Of course, we always strive for improvement, and that's what we've heard this afternoon, what you're trying to do. So can we thank you for that? Can I thank also the Ministry and the officials? Because, look, you can glibly say about our democracy, about all sorts of things, but actually the work that you do really adds value to our democracy and should not be underestimated. So thank you to you all. At this point, this is where we adjourn for our next panel convenes, and I think we will adjourn for 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome back to the London Assembly Election Review Working Group, where we're holding our final question and answer session into 2024 mayoral and assembly elections. I'd like to welcome our second panel of guests. So, Dr. Sophia Collignon, Senior Lecturer at Comparative Politics and Director of Mile End Institute, Queen Mary's University of London. Professor Tony Travers, Visiting Professor, Department of Government and Director, London School of Economics and Political Science. And finally, Thea Ridley Castle, Research and Policy Officer from Election Reform Society. Welcome to you all. Now, we've just earlier on, we heard evidence from both government, the Electoral Commission and representatives of the electoral officers in terms of carrying out elections. And this is our third hearing to date, third major meeting. So we've got a number of questions that will come from across this panel. If I can begin, Sophie, can I begin with you? And it's particularly about the issues of some of the issues that are important to us, but they're not going to rule out others. There'll be opportunities to bring in other issues. But if we can start with issues around harassment and intimidation, and particularly the data gap at regional level in understanding candidates' experiences of harassment, abuse and intimidation. Is there a concern? We on this side think there is, but we'd like to see what the academics have to say, particularly about this, around this issue. Do you know what I mean, around that?
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today. So on the topic, I would like to make 3 points. Perhaps. The first one is that, well, I have been doing research in the issue of harassment, abuse and intimidation since 2016. And the insights that I'm going to offer come from a lot of surveys that we have been running. So they are surveys of general election candidates in 2017, 2019, and now we are fielding another one. But we also, I mean, me and part of the team, we have been also running candidate surveys at the local level in elections in England in different places. One of the things that we are finding is that this is definitely an escalating problem, and that we have been seeing an increase between 2017 and 2019 in the proportion of candidates that have been harassed. In 2019, it was 1 in every 2, and that surpasses, reached almost 75% in 2019. So now we are seeing in 2024, the projection that we have currently is that about 3/4 of candidates are concerned about this issue. So it's not only that they have been victims of abuse, harassment and intimidation, but also that there is a contagion effect and feelings of security now are currently undermined. We also observe some gender dynamics. So women candidates are being targeted. We also see that women councillors and people of ethnic minority origin are more concerned about the issue of harassment and intimidation, and that these have had potentially, we haven't observed direct effects on the decision to stand again yet, but we are seeing currently that the way that the issue is being, it has been escalating, and the fact that it has been getting worse, and also there is more awareness about it, have been reaching to some levels, important levels of concern, and people are considering this when they decide to stand for office or not. Briefly, I would also like to make some or highlight some of the implications that it has at the local level, especially when local councillors are being victims. One of the things that they mention is one of the most harmful consequences is that they find it affects their capacity to do their job, because they are embedded in their communities, and if they have felt that the issue of that abuse, harassment or intimidation come from their neighbours or the people that live close by, that actually affects their day-to-day life. And coming back to the question of data gaps and what academics have done, I think that we have we have run, or individual academics have run, like my team, we run surveys that are periodical surveys. We can say how this issue is being manifested and how is it changing over time. However, we also have some gaps in the way of we don't really know who the perpetrators are, and there's also important gaps in depending on who the perpetrator is and what parties want to do, or what are the support that parties are offering to candidates and people in elected office, the consequences of the abuse vary.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, in terms of further steps that the GLA should take ahead of the 2028 elections to support candidates, and we've heard earlier about administrators to understand the issues of what they could do or what should others do to give some added security, added protection. Have you got any views on that, or what's best practice as far as you're concerned?
Yes. So based on the research that we have been doing, I can say that, well, we have uncovered disturbing public attitudes on this issue. So we find that more than 10%, so almost 20% of the people do not recognize certain actions as potentially abusive or harassing. And that means that currently we are seeing some tension between what people in public life will consider to be harassment or harassing or threatening behavior and what people consider to be acceptable. So there is, of course, initiatives that can be aimed at providing security to people in public life. But I will say that these measures also, I mean, there is no excuse for not doing them. But I think that it is important to have a complementary, more holistic approach that also look at conscientizing people and the public about what constitutes harassment and also why particular groups might find certain behaviors threatening. And one way of doing it is, first of all, we need to understand why they might find, for example, acceptable to follow people on the street or to be or to engage in very aggressive behavior. There is currently a lack of understanding of what is the limit between freedom of expression and actually expressing offensive and derogatory comments, for example, or when and under which circumstances it's acceptable to publicize certain information. We also find that it is important to improve digital literacy. We are observing that the spread of misinformation and doxing and smear campaigns is one of the most harmful actions that can happen. And of course, a lot of people answering have been telling us that, well, I mean, they find that it's in the public interest to spread this information without previously checking whether it's true or false. And there is a lack of critical thinking of whether the misinformation that they are spreading is actually sparking hate and putting some people at risk. And practically, I also would like to highlight the role of the police force and how important it is to establish best practices with the police force. So one key example is some of the actions that the police in Scotland are doing. For example, in Scotland, when there is a dedicated police officer, especially during the campaign, but also allocated to councillors. So councillors in Scotland can express their concerns directly to this point of contact, and because they have been receiving training about what can potentially constitute breaches of security, they are best trained and best placed to answer. Now, something that we are observing as well is that because of the decentralization of police forces, some candidates and also people in public, elected officials will tell us that the response that they are getting from the police is varying, and varies in quality, varies in what the police consider to be actionable threats, what is not. So another suggestion is also to engage much more in detail with the College of Policing and offer training that is mandatory for all police officers on the issue of harassment, abuse and intimidation in public life, which is particular and specific.
Did the rest of the panel, have you got any further observations on this issue? You're under no obligation to come in on this. In that sense, is there anything you want to share with us in terms of your views?
I mean, not research-based, which is why I was very cautious in putting in some evidence. I mean, anecdotally, but talking to a number of elected officials at all three levels of government in London and beyond London, in fact, it's clear that the advent of the anonymity that comes with social media has made it vastly easier to turn what you might call the acceptable rough and tumble of politics into something nasty and darker. I mean, it's just clearly it's the anonymity that's offered by being able to make comments about people, personal remarks, worse. And I can see the problem from the police's point of view. You've got just 75 MPs in London, 26 elected members in this building, 1,800 odd plus councillors, you know. With the best will in the world, the police would be hard pushed, and that's just in London, to help them all. But I suspect that you will know better than we do. These things are different from the past, and probably not better or worse than in the past, for the anonymity that comes with the social media.
Thank you. Let's go to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. And moving towards voter turnout.
Yeah.
So my first question is for you, Tony. And it is whether the lack of public knowledge about the role of regional government is a barrier to increased turnout at elections. So if people don't really know what regional government is for, they maybe don't think it's important enough to go and vote for it.
I mean, the fact that the turnout is higher, I mean, it's an intriguing curiosity of the London government system that the average turnout in assembly and mayoral elections is somewhat higher than it is in borough elections, even though, if you talk to most people on the street, they will, if you ask who should do something about this, they'll say the council. So we know from a lot of research about the public's understanding of who does what in government, all levels of government, and you know, with due respect, most people don't spend their entire lives studying government systems. They often aren't entirely aware who is doing what, which level, and in fairness to the public, most voters, you know, who's responsible for housing? Well, central government a bit, the mayor a bit, City Hall a bit, the boroughs a bit. So the public would be right to be somewhat confused because it's confusing. But I think that the fact that turnouts in GLA elections are on average higher than in borough elections probably suggests, I mean, that the level of understanding is relatively high. I would say the evidence suggests it's very high for services such as public transport. Mm-hmm. So the tube is very obviously a mayoral responsibility. The buses are a mayoral responsibility. I think people know that. Politicians at other levels of government react accordingly. So I think that's easily understood. So even if it was, though it isn't only an election about transport, you get quite a lot of comprehension. So, but I suppose the better answer to your question is obviously more understanding would lead to higher turnouts. And in local elections, even general election in the UK these days, turnouts are not very high by European standards. Mm-hmm. So they could be higher. But I'd say that the balance between turnout at the borough level and the city-wide level is, you know, slightly in city-wide level's favour, actually, mm-hmm. on average.
Is there anything you think that is... are there any barriers to turnout and participation that that could be addressed to improve? I mean, because it's always the more turnout you get, the better legitimacy the elected people have. So, are there any other barriers that you think need addressing?
Well, we do know from not research I was involved with, but other academics have done research which has shown, in looking at behavioural insights and encouraging people to change their behaviour modestly for very low cost themselves. And there's certainly been research done showing that if you, I mean, as simple as if you go around and tell people on election day it's election day, more people will vote. Okay? That easy. And I think people, if you look at polling, more people say they voted than vote, so there's a sense that it's a good thing to do. The public thinks voting is inherently a morally good thing to do. So, I think you can only go so far with information campaigns, but no question, if you tell people on election day it's election day, they're more likely to vote. You'll know that, you go canvassing, but you know what I mean? That's why parties go canvassing. But a third party is going and saying, why don't you, do you know it's election day, actually increases the vote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing that's, that's ways of encouraging people to vote, but I'm just wondering if there's any actual barriers, nothing...
Well, I mean, it's at the risk of straying into a much wider and different conversation. I think the decline in regional and local media doesn't help with all of this. One of the great artifact of our time is that, all traditional media, actually, so-called mainstream media, have seen their share of the total audience decline, but within that, local newspapers, the Standard now is a once a week. It's online, obviously, but it's not on the streets every day. There used to be 3 evening papers in London within even my memory. So, and it's not unique to London. There's other cities have exactly the same issue. So I do think the decline of the local media and the fact that BBC and ITV have short opt-out programmes, very little other than the evening news, means that the capacity that you sometimes, when you go to New York, you see there are, it'd be ideal for everybody here, news programmes on every night about what inside City Hall, quite a lot going on inside City Hall there at the moment. But so I do think that now, having said that, and others are more expert than me, the new media is capable of targeting messages very effectively indeed, and parties do that. But I suspect that the decline of the traditional media sort of doesn't help a general sense of civic understanding. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hard to prove that, but I'll rest it there.
Thank you. Thea or Sophia, did either of you want to come in on that?
Can I come in?
Yeah, you
can. My point is going to be very brief, but only I would like to mention some barriers that have been mentioned for people with disabilities, especially to find accessible polling stations. It was brought to my attention that, for example, people that suffer of sight loss or blind people, they have very limited opportunities to vote, because there is limited information that is available for them on where the polling stations are located. And also, in many occasions, they cannot access the polling station, or they cannot have the appropriate paperwork for them to be able to vote.
I think for the recent GLA elections, there was a huge amount of work done to buy equipment to help people with sight loss to vote. And so I think accessibility has been something that they have been thinking about in this recent set of elections, probably picking up on very much that point that you were just making.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there is a huge opportunity to keep on working with organizations that are working with different forms of disability.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we've been hearing that very loud and clear. Thea?
Thank you for inviting me today. I just wanted to add something on kind of like talking about turnout figures and the fact that we're missing a lot of people from the register in the first place. The ERS has done some analysis looking at the kind of potential figures of numbers of people that we might be missing or incorrectly registered on the electoral register, and surprised to say that in London you've got about 6 of the top 10 constituencies that we were looking at in terms of percentage of missing or inaccurately registered voters, coming in at 20.3% of voters that we believe that could be on the register in cities of London and Westminster. So when we're talking about turnout, it's really important to kind of think about the people that are not registered at the moment, and one of the ways that we think that is a way to get around this is to introduce automated or automatic voter registration. also in talking about, you mentioned kind of like getting into people's homes and reminding them, that would mean that everybody got a poll card before the election, so you actually get a physical reminder through people's doors. We also know that there are lots of barriers to registering to vote, specifically for people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, for disabled people. MenCap did some research talking about how 60% of the people they surveyed found registering to vote to be a barrier. And they found that difficult. We also know people in privately rented accommodation, which is a vast majority of Londoners, are less likely to be registered to vote. So when we're talking about turnout, I think it's important to remember that there's a big chunk of the population that's not on the register, and they need to be moved on the register in order to everybody have their democratic rights.
Really good point, and actually, having been door knocking last weekend, it's amazing how many addresses just don't have anyone registered. So, yeah, very strong point. Moving on, and this question is for you initially, Thea. We've had some conversation in our earlier session about how to describe the proportional election voting system to Londoners. It's quite straightforward, you know, for the mayor, whether you've got the first choice, second choice system, or whether it's first past the post, you are voting for a mayor of London. For the constituency vote, it's clear you're voting for a choice between people from different parties who are standing to represent an assembly constituency. So you're voting for a candidate who will be your constituency member. When it comes to the London-wide election, that's really complicated to explain it in very, very simple language that everyone can understand. And I just wonder whether you've got any thoughts about how the London-wide system, you know, which is where people are voting for a party, which determines the proportions of members representing each party reflected on the eventual 25-member assembly, how to describe that in a way that is simple and straightforward for people to understand. And yes, everyone else, I'll be coming to you as well.
I mean, I wish I could give you a kind of 5-word answer to that, but different systems are more complicated. One of the kind of examples that I would point to is New Zealand's communication campaign after they switched to they call it MMP, AMS. I can't remember back when now. I think it was like late 90s. And in fact, I was looking up this morning kind of because they constantly update their communications on this, and they do a very interesting graphic with like apples and pears and parties and like, talking about how it's easier to vote. But, you know, New Zealand has had a support for their change in voting system. People understand the voting system, so I would look to them in terms of evidence, and I'm happy to forward you over the link of the video I was watching, but it also had other information on there that might be quite helpful.
That would be really helpful. Yes, yeah, please do share. Tony, did you have any thoughts on a simple way of describing it?
I did read the conversation or the exchanges that took place in an earlier hearing on this, and I rather agree that, you know, at least we're not trying to explain the D'Hondt system. We're spared that. But it is very, very, very hard, I think, to explain what... Once you know, it's like everything else, once you know it, it's clear what it is, but to describe it to people who understandably don't spend their lives thinking about electoral systems, most people, is genuinely difficult. There's a different, it's called, and the fact it's called a London-wide member does, at the margin, add to that confusion, because it's really a way of achieving proportionality through a city-wide vote, but those words don't sound great either, do they? So I can see that, and I did wonder, I mean, about other systems that are similar, so this is a great point. I mean, I don't know whether the Scots or the Welsh or Germany uses this kind of system a lot, whether they've done better than we've managed in the past, I don't know, but I can see that it's an important conceptual difference between imagining you're electing a London-wide member in a big constituency and achieving proportionality between the parties on a 25-member system where 14 members are elected by constituencies and 11 are elected by a proportional system. Very interesting, you know, academics are good at creating these.
Those 11 elected by the proportional system the proportions include the 14 who are elected by first past the post. So those seats go into the mix of the proportions. So I mean, I'm just wondering how, whether someone can come up with some amazing graphic that describes it simply for Londoners.
If apples and pears may be the answer.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to checking out the New Zealand apples and pears.
But just to, I mean, because it is important, because I mean, this year's election result was a particularly clear example of how it works, because the Conservative Party did enormously well this time out of the so-called London-wide members, but that did reflect the fact that their percentage of the vote share was what it was, and the reality of it is quite easy to see once it's happened. It's describing it in advance that's difficult.
Yep. Sophia.
Just to quickly add something there, maybe I would suggest to take a step back and trying to understand which are the demographics that are not really grasping the system first. And this is because probably the form of communicating will be very different if the demographic is older than 40 or between 40 and 50, or is a younger generation that are not getting what the system or how the system looks like. I will say that, for example, I will always advocate to have more civic education in schools. For me, that's a key to socialize people under 16 that are necessarily that are going to start becoming voters very time soon about what are the intricacies of the system. And also, by having more civic education in schools, we can also prevent harassment, but that's just on top of it. I just strongly advocate for that, but also if it's not necessarily on the content, but something that has worked very well for other type of campaigns is also to have infographics and short videos that can be circulated on social media. That particularly has been proven to be very effective to reach younger generations. And I mean, one image says more than 1,000 words, so I will suggest that as a form. But
okay, well, we will keep researching and look with interest at the New Zealand examples, and keep hunting for the holy grail of clear descriptions of our voting system. Tony,
I mean, just one thought. I mean, from first principles, that in a sense, I suspect almost everybody would immediately understand what proportional shares are. Everybody, all members of the public would understand you get 25% of the votes, you get 25% of the seats idea. But they also know what constituencies are, because they're the only thing we've ever learned, really. That's what most of our voting is like. And so being able, because they'll know both those ideas, explaining how we're keeping elements of one, but in order to make it also like the other, I would have thought would be quite an easy set of steps, because people will understand both ideas. It's just a way of explaining how in this particular election you're fusing them. Mm-hmm. I think graphics would do this.
Graphically fusing the two electoral systems. Clear recommendation. Thank you. The sort of brief for the graphic designer. Tony and Sophia, do you have views on the lack of ward and borough level data for these elections, including the issue of turnout data? And is this an issue for academics? And how is it? What's the impact of this? Sophia, do you want to go first?
I mean, the more disaggregated the data that we can get, the better. It is an issue if we want to make inferences at a higher level. So aggregating data and reaching conclusions at a higher level is relatively easy, but disaggregating data is almost impossible. Mm-hmm. So that works for, there are different techniques to do that, but it has been proven very inaccurate and inefficient. So definitely, if we can have more data at the ward level, it will be more, we could design better interventions to either target the specific sections of the population with the information that they need, but also look at how different socio-demographics might be affecting outcomes. So I will definitely advocate for something as disaggregated as possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tony?
I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, it is, of course, unhelpful that those of us on this side of the table and on your side of the table are the two groups with the greatest interest in this. We are exactly politicians and political parties, understandably, academics and researchers and think tanks similarly have a vested interest in this. But even if you stand back from that vested interest, which, you know, I'm sure we all can, I do think, I mean, the loss of the Time series, you know, it's like a library no longer buying books they've always bought annually back into the mists of time. Must be driven by the past only, but I do think it's important not to lose continuity in these things. So that's the first thing I'd say. And I do think it not just for researchers, but there is a genuine, and I hadn't really thought, but Sophia's point is a very good one, ward-by-ward information or borough-by-borough information does allow us to see differences which have a meaning. You know, turnouts are much lower in some places than others. Why? They're higher in some places than others. Why? There are some wards that will be or boroughs even, that have particular characteristics, and if there are big differences, it would be good to know those in order that they can be researched. So I totally agree with that. The other thing I'd say, which I did write in some evidence I sent before, is that I think the fact that there was effectively something of a laissez-faire, I mean, a slight difference of opinion between the returning officer, the Greater London returning officer, and individual returning officers, is not good for other reasons, because that creates a sense, wrongly no doubt, sense that those running the election, or if somebody wanted to say, they could say those running the election weren't quite in charge or weren't quite on top of how the system should work. Now, there's ambiguity in the law, which is not the returning officer's fault, but I do think it's the kind of thing that, if I may say so, a working group of this kind can make strong recommendations for not only in terms of the output of data, but in terms of trust in the election, that everybody understands what's supposed to happen.
Yep. So clarity about that you have the same happening across every count.
Well, given there are people out there who say that all elections are frauds these days, and there's an increasing willingness of bad people, bad actors, to try to undermine democracy and liberal democracy more generally, more particularly, I think anything that allows those bad people to say there's something intrinsic to the way the system is operated, we told you there was something wrong, well, here's something that isn't quite right. And you know, it allows people to build on what is actually just officers in this building in their London elects mode looking back at some regulations that were made in 2007, which it now turns out left this degree of ambiguity, so different returning officers, the Greater London constituency, could interpret the rules differently or chose to. And that kind of thing just needs to be made clear.
So getting that tidied up before we have another...
So it's do we have the data, which I think we're all agreed, yes, but tidying up, which is a separate issue, so that bad actors can't allege somehow the people running the election don't know 100% of what they're doing. Yep. I'm not saying they don't know what they're doing, but it would allow people outside to say that if they wanted to.
Yep. Thank you. Thea, did you want to add anything on this, or are you all good?
Just echo the remarks of the rest of the panel. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, let's return to Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about voter ID, but also thinking back to our last panel who, in the Electoral Commission in particular, were talking about the fact that there's been so much change recently with the last elections that they wanted to have a time to not have change, and in that, I left that part of the meeting going, well, that's not really in the spirit of how I usually work in terms of politics. I'm always pushing for change, but also we need to see improvements and we need to have recommendations to make things better. In terms of voter ID, we have done a call for evidence, and it's the Mile End Institute did say that 1 in 5 voters were unaware of the requirement for voter ID, and the Electoral Reform Society responded by saying, given the problems with the voter ID scheme to date and the lack of evidence of the need for strict voter ID laws in the UK, the ERS believes voter ID should be scrapped. So considering what the Commission, the Electoral Commission has just said, Theo, what's your response to that and your statement that you made?
The ERS is on the side of the voter in this kind of instance, and I don't believe that kind of waiting to see the changes implemented will benefit the voter in this instance. The ERS still believes that voter ID should be scrapped. If it is not scrapped, we would like to see a range of improvements to it, which would introduce vouching, statutory instruments to mean, not statutory instruments, declarations so that you could vouch for yourself, signed affidavit, those type of thing, expanding the list of ID requirements. We still adamantly believe that it should be scrapped. We believe that it disproportionately affects different groups. We know at these elections there has been slightly less people affected than the last local elections, and in the general election the percentages were around the same amount. We did do some kind of preliminary analysis looking at parliamentary constituencies and mapping ethnicity data onto those constituencies, looking at the places where over 0.5% of people were turned away because of voter ID requirements. And we did find in those constituencies they had significantly more Asian, Black and minority ethnic populations. That's 73 constituencies across the entire of the UK. We believe that's a massive problem. Voter ID, we think, is a solution kind of looking for a problem. If we look at, I think it was the 2021 elections, there were 6 cases of electoral fraud brought up in the mayoral elections, and none of those were taken forward, as far as I know. And if you look at the kind of figures that we had this time around, there was like over 1,500 people that were unable to cast their vote because of voter ID, and those numbers don't add up, in my view.
I mean, the argument to bring it in was to tackle fraud. There's no evidence in terms of from what you've done and your research that would say that this has been tackled by using ID or made any difference.
No, don't believe so. We haven't done our own surveys, but looking at other people's kind of stuff that they've put out. We also don't believe that voter ID has increased any trust in a voting system. Looking at the kind of stats that are coming out about how we vote, voting in the UK is seen as quite a trustworthy procedure, and voter ID has not significantly changed concepts of trust in the ballot procedure.
So, in terms of London itself, London is incredibly diverse, with a young population as well, and also the people that you were just talking about in terms of the people who are less likely to vote do tend to be living in this city. So, do you think that when it comes to London specifically in the London elections, there should be a move away from voter ID?
I'd argue that not just London specifically, across the entire of the UK, but London definitely with the high majorities of ethnic minority populations, privately renting people and stuff like that, definitely should be moving away from voter ID regulations or introducing instruments that mean that a lot more people have access to ID. The trials in 2018, I believe it was, allowed the use of poll cards for voter ID, and I believe the turnaway rate for that, the constituencies where poll cards were used, was over 98%. Sorry, the opposite of that. They weren't turned away, so a lot less people were being turned away. I might have it written down here, actually, what that was. I've just got the lowest percentage.
You can send that to us later, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Tony, the Electoral Commission did do a public opinion poll and found that London adults, 24% of them opposed to it, IDs, and 63% supported it. So why do you think that there is that reaction when they did a poll compared to the research that Theo was just talking about?
Well, I mean, polling, will always show up of every kind in a democracy like this. Wide ranges of difference of strength of opinion on particular issues, and the fact that 63% of people think something's a good idea doesn't mean we should do it. It just helps us make a decision, as the 4%, whatever it is the other way, similarly, who are opposed to it. I mean, the Electoral Commission's research on local elections in 2023 suggested that the overall, now there's a qualification to this, the number of people who were turned away at the polling station and didn't go back was very small. What we don't know, of course, is how many people didn't go in the first place because they didn't like the idea. And that could be of any age or background, it seems to me. And I think, so I'm agnostic. This is not helpful, because going back to the concern about trust, I mean, I do think trust in electoral systems, particularly these days, is massively important. We've got examples from other countries, where the challenge to elections is greater than it's been before, and I think we need to be wary of the threat to systems and perceptions of trust and perceptions of trust in systems. So I absolutely take the point that if we have voter ID, then we know every effort must be made to ensure people of every background, every group, every ethnicity know how to do this and have forms of identity, and it's made easy, and you can't have inconsistencies where some Oyster cards work and others don't. But, in the end, I don't detect much move within government and politics in any political party to change this, so I think we may be in the business of trying to improve it more than reform it, but remove it.
So if you were to encourage the government to consider evaluating the policy, it would be rather just to improve what's already in place?
Well, yeah. I mean, that would be my view.
Not get rid of it completely, but...
I think that, I'd rather have the Electoral Commission do it, but somebody, and they have done it up to a point. We need to have more evidence about who's been excluded and why, and then fit policy to help them, because a large number of people need no help, but a small number need a lot of help, to Sophia's point earlier. And so with that in mind, I think that's where effort should be targeted.
Okay, and is there any other comments from the panel on this? No, thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on to Assembly Member Garrett.
Thanks. Actually, just on that theme about trust and confidence in elections, I don't think we have a question on this, but we did ask it to the previous panel, and it sort of is relevant to this, about electronic counting versus manual counting. And we've taken a lot of evidence from the people who run those counts and the people who oversee those counts and so on, and actually from the political parties who are involved in them as well. So we've heard that evidence. Just from your point of view, I don't know whether there's any evidence about electronic versus manual counts and trust and confidence that you're aware of. I should say the evidence we've had from all of our panels is quite mixed. People have a variety of opinions about these, including me. I'm a traditionalist. But it's not my opinion that we're after. Sophia?
Yes, well, in Mexico there was done, previously it was a manual counting. I mean, if you're looking for international examples, there was, originally it was on manual counting, and then they started doing the rapid electoral results using electronic counting. And then the first time that it was done, it was a huge backlash, and people were thinking that it was going to be unreliable. However, the Electoral Institute in Mexico was able to show that actually the proportion correlates very strongly, and that there were no reason to distrust the electronic counting. Now, that meant that in posterior elections, people were actually very trusty on what the electoral counting was saying and what the rapid counting results were.
Okay.
So I will say that that's an example where it has been successfully applied, and also people's mind has been successfully adapting to this.
So just to clarify, so that was people voted on paper and then the paper was counted electronically?
So it happened in both. So originally, it was people voting in paper and then counting electronically. They have been moving out now to a system when people outside the national territory can vote electronically, and that has been. There hasn't been any issues with trust about that. So I would say that the change was incremental, and it has been working.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether either of the other two had anything to say on that. No.
Yeah.
No. Oh, Tony.
I mean, it seems to me that the question of whether people, again, we're back to a system which most of us know only one thing for most elections. It's a sort of piece of theatre, isn't it, of people sitting at trestle tables in a room like this one, but bigger, counting with party officials watching them, and it's incredibly diffuse across the United Kingdom, and all the parties get their capacity to watch what's going on, and as a result of both it being diffuse and the parties being present and it being visible, means there are virtually no challenges to it at all. And the great thing about the recent general election is whatever you think about the results, nobody seriously, you might challenge the system of voting, we think we should have a different system of voting, but nobody said this system is cheated or rigged in any way, because everybody can see it, it's open. And the only risk with machines, and I'm not sure there's any evidence of this, and we've just heard that perhaps with machines, is that it does put into the system something, a sort of box that people can't understand. So I'm just saying, in terms of if we're all interested in trust in elections, the existing system, however marvellously traditional it might be, does appear to be diffuse enough and open enough to make it very hard for accusations of people fiddling the system to be made.
Understood. Thanks.
Just like to echo that slightly and say that we see that trust in our actual elections is very high. Whether people have trust in the government elected is different, but trust in elections is high, and I'd be cautious doing anything to change that. And kind of echoing what you were saying, more research would be needed, and we'd need to look into that in a lot more detail at the ERS to be able to come down on a policy position about whether we believe manual versus e-counting or electronic voting is right for the UK.
Yeah. There was actually, on your point, Tony, there was actually an attempt that I saw to claim that the result in the GLA election had been fixed by the mayor, and the fact that I've been standing in the count allowed me to just directly contradict those people and say, no, I saw those ballot papers, there's nobody there, there's nobody interfering with them. But I take Sophia's point that sometimes people can get quite worked up about something, and then when it's done, it's fine. We've seen that in politics once or twice. Anyway, that wasn't my question. My set of questions is about the mayoral voting system, which is a thing that sometimes people have opinions about. So perhaps if I start with you, Thea. So obviously the system was the voting system was changed for this most recent election. Or perhaps I should say, how, in your view, should the government evaluate that decision to change from the supplementary vote, where people have a first and second preference, to first past the post for the mayoral election?
We believe that the change to first past the post from supplementary vote has damaged the mandate of the mayor. So in terms of kind of looking at the proportion of people that voted for Sadiq Khan in this election, it was 43.8%, which is the lowest proportion of votes across the 7 mayoral contests held. The lowest under supplementary vote was Ken Livingstone on 44.4 in 2000. And under supplementary vote, the winner typically receives closer to 50% of the vote. So in the last two elections, it was 50.4 and 47.6. Our working on that is looking at the first preference, supported by the transferred votes in the second preference, divided by the total number of votes to get a percentage of people that support the elected mayor, Sadiq Khan. We believe that when looking at evaluation, it needs to be looking at the proportionality and looking at the people's voices that weren't heard in the election of the mayor. We did do some analysis looking at the London-wide AMS allocation of votes and the first-past-the-post mayoral votes, and we can see a disparity which leads us to think that there is suggestions of tactical voting that is happening under first-past-the-post, which I know everybody hears about, and less of that under additional member systems. In this case, Sadiq Khan, on 43.8% of the vote, is 5 points up from the kind of share that Labour got in the London-wide assembly on 38.4% of the vote, and the kind of list kind of disparity goes across all the major parties in that respect. Tactical voting means that people can't express their true preference. It means that they don't get the person that they want. We believe that it should be moved back to supplementary vote, even better, alternate vote.
Okay. And what's your reflection on, so last time around there were about 85,000 people whose votes were cast but could not be counted because they had incorrectly filled in, this was on the mayoral side, so they were counted as spoilt ballots, but in fact what had happened, it wasn't a deliberately spoilt ballot, it was that they had voted twice in the first column or something like that, and it couldn't be counted. That's obviously a very large number of people. It's now, I can't remember what the number is, I think it was...
I think about 11,000, something like that.
Sorry?
Around 11,000.
Yeah, I was going to say it was dramatically lower. So obviously that is a potential trade-off in terms of, because those people think that they had cast their vote. They thought their voice, let me try that again, thought their voice was being counted, but it wasn't. To what extent do you weigh that against the benefits that you've just described of a first and second preference system, whichever one it might be?
My understanding of the issues with the last time around with the supplementary vote in 2001 was the issue with the ballot design rather than the actual system itself. I believe that they were asked to put 2 crosses, and there was over 15 candidates, and there should have been. The paper could only fit 15 in 2 columns, so you had 4 columns, so people were putting crosses. So I believe that's an issue of ballot design rather than electoral system, and I think that goes back to Assembly Members Russell's point about how we communicate with voters, and we need to make sure that the voting communications prior to the election has the same messaging that they have in the election, in the polling station, and on the ballot papers, to be very clear about what they need to do. So if we're saying it's 2 ticks, 1 tick, whatever messaging you want, that needs to run through all the way to the ballot design. So I think that's more of a question of ballot design rather than issues with the voting system itself.
Okay. Tony, voting systems and the like.
Well, I mean, there are examples outside of London where, and I'm trying to remember where they are, so I think I'm going to get one but not the other, where there have been votes since the first and second preference supplementary vote system was dropped, where they might well have gone the other way. I think Bedford was one. There's 2, I think, outside London, since this provision was changed outside London. So you could get a different result. But, however, it would be in a very, very, very tight contest. The thing about the London mayoral election results since it started is, despite the introduction of 2 different forms of, in one case very, in the other case slightly, proportional representation, the mayoral election, in my view, has always had some of the characteristics of a forced choice. That is, people vote for the top 2 candidates one way or another. And in that sense, no candidate who came top on first preferences ever lost the election on with the second preferences counted. So this system, you could argue, moving to first past the post for the first time for this election, didn't produce that big a change in vote shares for the top 2 parties, given that there was always that forced choice element. But it is true that people who want to vote as it were, green first preference, and then for one of the candidates that's likely to win for the second preference, that is, you know, the person you'd really like to win, or the party you'd really like to win, and then the one of the two that's going to win that you least dislike, if I can put it that way, that does offer a slightly wider, more complex choice, but I would argue that politicians and parties will change their messaging to reflect the different kind of election. So you'll get some adjustment. Once you know you're in one system rather than the other, they'll adjust their campaigning. So I was personally surprised how very little difference it appeared to make in terms of the votes for the two top parties. The forced choice there was still there, because it would be different in a city where there was a very different layout of voters, and where there wasn't this for many, many years, and it might change in the future, two major parties vying for number 1 and 2 position over the city as a whole over a very long time. But in that kind of city, it looks to me a bit like a forced choice, whichever system you use.
Yes, actually, in terms of political party messaging, I did once get a message from a party, I won't name them, who told me that Labour couldn't win here, and that was in a European election where I felt Labour had half a chance of getting a seat in London. I won't name which bar chart friendly party that was from. I had another question. We possibly have... So, apologies, Sophia. Did you want to come in on the question of voting systems?
No, I'm fine.
OK. I had another question here. I don't know whether we've quite answered it on voters' perceptions of different voting systems. I don't know whether we've possibly covered that. We've looked at it from the back end, if you like, from the front end. Do we know what voters themselves make of different systems?
We would kind of look at the British Social Attitude Survey in terms of public perceptions of voting systems, and the recent one in 2024 showed that public trust is kind of at its highest. Public support for proportional systems is at its highest. In fact, those who almost never trust governments believe that changing the system for 62% kind of support that. So if we're looking at the kind of trust in politics and turnout angle, I'm not saying that a proportional system would increase turnout, but I'm saying that people that don't trust the systems that we currently have, a change in a system towards proportional representation does seem to be a popular suggestion for them. This isn't something that we see as a kind of one-off in the 2024 data. Professor John Curtis and Scholes said that in 2022 that the majority backed proportional systems, and this is the same in 2024. So we would expect that this is to continue. Yeah.
And that, I guess we're particularly thinking about the mayor, or the mayoral voting system rather. That, when you talk about proportional systems, do you include a kind of, you know, the first and second preference? It's debatable whether that's proportional. It's more proportional than first past the post, but it's not technically proportional in the sense that you're just electing one person. So that research applies to that, you think? The
research states proportional systems, and that's up to the kind of individual to understand what they understand as a proportional system. At ERS, we would advocate for alternative vote, which is a more proportional way of electing a single member for something like a mayor. But anything that allows voters more choice, we believe the research shows that there is more support for that. So in a supplementary system where you can have more choice, we believe that would be a more trusted and a more popular system.
Forgive me, how would AMS be different from STV in terms of how the vote? So the additional member, you said you would favour additional member for all?
No, alternative vote. Sorry.
My apologies.
Alternative vote. I wrote this down because we get asked this so often, and I will forget because there's about 1 million that we have to talk about.
This is me hinting back to Tony's point earlier that not everyone spends their life thinking about electoral systems.
I know, and even I do it day in, day out, and I still have to write it down. So, in supplementary vote, you have 2 votes of first preference and a second preference. If no candidate gets over 50% of the first preference votes, the second preference are counted, and whoever wins that gets the result, the job. In alternative vote, you get 1 ballot, you can rank your preferences on that ballot. If nobody gets 50% of the vote, then the loser, the person that has got the least amount of first preferences, the second preferences looked at that and they're reallocated across. So we believe that's a more proportionate system. You keep going like that until you get over 50%, sorry. So it's a more proportionate system in that way.
So there are 2 different methods of doing effectively a simulated runoff election but one effectively just has 2 stages and the other one is a multi-stage incremental where you're gradually eliminating one candidate at a time. That sounds like...
Yes. I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did Tony or Sophia, did you have anything on this? It's my last question, just about voters' perception of voting systems.
I mean, it's worth noting that in 2011, the UK was given a vote on this reform and didn't rejected even the fairly modest reform that was proposed in that. Having said that, and to Thea's point, the fact that at the most recent general election, the Conservative and Labour parties, which for all sorts of obvious reasons support this, the first past the post system, and have done for a long, long time, got their lowest vote share in modern history. And loads of other parties, Greens, Reform, Liberal Democrats, others, most of whom, for obvious reasons, do support proportional representation of whatever kind, that their vote share has relatively and absolutely grown. You would expect, I think, to see, if more people feel that they're voting for a party where, you know, to take the Reform vote in the general election, you get a very substantial number of votes and virtually no seats. Mm-hmm. You can see why people in that party, or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens, might well think that the system doesn't work for them in larger numbers. So it may be opinion will change as if the number of people not voting Conservative or Labour reduces. So the number of people not voting Conservative or Labour increases.
Yeah. Understood. Okay. I don't think you had... No? Okay, that's me done. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Assembly Member Russell.
Yes, I just wanted to come in on this issue of the mayoral voting system. We heard in our last... not a meeting today, but a meeting a couple of weeks ago, from some of the field organisers for the different political parties. And certainly the 2 main parties loved the fact that it got on to first past the post, because they said it just made it so easy. You know, it was a 2-horse race, really simple messaging. We know how to win those elections. And certainly it is tougher for the smaller parties to win those first past the post elections. And we're all doing as well as we possibly can, and under that system in the last general election. But I think that but Londoners did vote when the London elections were first set up, did vote for the system that we have. It was taken away without a reference to London voters. London voters had no say in something that they had expressed a very clear and very firm, definite opinion on when this whole system was set up. And I just wonder, just in terms of the whole piece about trust in elections, do you think it is sensible at least to give Londoners a say in what voting's, in whether that voting system should have been changed to first past the post? And also, I think, just picking up on the point that Thea made about the legitimacy of the mayor, that having a vote that is, down at, 43.8%, so 44% roughly this time, rounded up, rather than being closer to 50%, do you think that, do you think that's a problem? And also, do you think it might be useful to a mayor to understand where their second preference votes come from? Because that's, knowing that that they can't win the support of Londoners, with that, just on that first vote, they can't get themselves over the 50% on the first vote, so they need those second preference votes. Do you think that's a useful thing for a mayor of London to have in mind, sort of in terms of democratically representing Londoners? Sorry, that's a load of questions all in one go, but Thea, do you want to go first?
I will try to tackle them. On the point of should Londoners have been consulted on changing the voting system, yes, we believe that they should have been consulted. No kind of system changes like that or drastic changes to participation shouldn't be consulted on. In terms of kind of like what that consultation should have looked like, we would advocate for something like the use of a citizens' assembly in kind of more complex matters like that, where you would have experts on the panel that could help explain, and then their recommendations were taken up. That should be the case in kind of all devolved kind of nations and regions in that sense. In terms of the legitimacy and the mandate, I think the point that I was trying to make is that in order to kind of govern a city of London, you need to have majorities, or I believe that you should have majority support of the people that have elected you. And by changing the voting system, it's making that a lot more difficult to achieve. Also, under a system of proportional representation, there has to be more coming outside of your traditional lane of voters, as you were saying about second preference voting. And I would argue, and some research does show, that kind of coming across party lines and appealing to a broader group of people can lead to a kind of more compromising politics and make it less kind of about party lines and having more of voices of different people into the discussion, which can't be a bad thing for democracy.
Thank you. Sophia, did you want to?
Yes. So very briefly, So I think that the discussion, as I am hearing it now, has been focused a lot on issues of representation. So when we ask what people want from a voting system, we are more concerned about whether they feel or not represented. However, another side of the same coin is issues of accountability and how difficult it is, how difficult it is for voters to assign accountability or to hold representatives accountable in different, under different voting systems. So I believe that right now maybe we can find that, because the public discussion has been a lot about who is representing us and how parties how niche parties, for example, or parties that are not mainstream, are not necessarily finding a way to have a representative in different elected bodies. I think maybe now people might be more inclined to saying that proportional representation is a good system. However, I think, or I will encourage the discussion as well to focus on accountability and how are we going to tell people who is accountable for their actions, and can they penalize politicians that misbehave in the ballot box if it's difficult to assign accountability. And I think that if we move to that discussion, probably I will say that a mixed system as it is now can hold the best of both worlds. So that's my...
Sorry, just to be clear, when you say a mixed system...
Yeah, so for example, when part of the when part is elected by constituency in a first past the post, as it is, and the other part by proportional representation in whatever form of proportional representation we find.
I think what we're talking about here is for the mayor election, we had a proportional system and the government changed the system and made it first past the post. So whereas what we had in London was a proportional system, or a semi-proportional system for electing the mayor, which has been taken away by the last government. And so it's whether...
Yeah, and what I wanted to say is that first past the post make it easier to assign responsibility. Yeah.
So you're saying you think first past the post makes the accountability clearer?
Easier, yeah.
I mean, to the point, in the original referendum on the creation of the Greater London Authority, the voting system was in the referendum, and although we don't in Britain have a sort of constitution that embeds these things when votes of that place take place, I think that, you know, given that that was embedded, as was the Assembly's voting system, I think probably one should have regard, government should have regard to that kind of referendum-based vote. Generally, where we have referendums, governments do take notice of what they say. So that would be the first thing. It's interesting that the decision was made to change the mayoral voting system, which was so proportional. I mean, it was a bit proportional, but not to change the Assembly. That would have led to a very different result this year. So there was an intriguing sort of shift of position there in deciding to get rid of it for one election, and actually got rid of it for the election where there was least evidence that it produced much of a proportional shift. If you look at the vote shares for all the parties back through the years to 2000, there's very little evidence there was a radical change this time, but there would have been a radical change if the Assembly election had moved to first past the post. Now, I'm not advocating that, I'm just observing it. So let's say that. And then just the final thing I say, it would be pretty bad going back to trust in democracy if we, and the trouble is I don't know where to land on this one, if we then changed it every time there's a change of government. So we'll go back to supplementary vote, then come back to first past, that wouldn't be good. So somehow people of goodwill need to advocate sticking with one system, whichever it is. Just one final, slight light-hearted but serious point. The voting, when you looked at the first and second preference voting for different candidates in elections, it was always a delight because you could see not only all the people who voted for the same candidate twice, people who voted for very unlikely parties, one and then two, and then completely implausible first preference for an extreme leftist party and then their second preference for an extreme right-wing party. So it was a very interesting way of understanding the electorate's approach to voting.
Assembly Member Bakari.
I just wanted to clarify, because as I was listening, I was thinking about the benefits of diversity and the candidates that come and stand in a London election that is based on proportional representation and how that impacts the way people vote. Would you say that the system that we have in place right now, particularly for I'm not talking about the mayor, I'm talking about the London seat that is based on proportional representation, does encourage that diversity of candidate coming through, and then also in turn encourage people to vote because you're more likely to have your voice heard and your vote matters in a proportional representation approach? And is that the argument that we should be pushing forward to encourage more people to be voting and to be to be more engaged, because therefore those diverse voices will be more likely to be heard because of that approach to the system that we have that is based on proportional representation? I'm kind of looking at Thea here because I'm hoping that you'll give me an answer to that.
There is evidence that shows that proportional systems like AMS in the London Assembly does produce more diverse assemblies. I'm again thinking of New Zealand, and since they changed their voting system, the number of ethnic minority MPs, women and LGBTQ plus MPs has increased there. That is not to say that purely changing a voting system is going to increase and attract those people to stand. There needs to be a conversation about culture as well, which I think has been touched on previously. But the research on turnout does suggest that proportional systems have an increased turnout. Again, that's not to say that purely changing to a proportional system will increase turnout. It's just looking at around the world, countries that have systems of proportional representation have higher turnout. So if we want to start thinking about kind of the underlying kind of things that we can put in place in order to improve diversity representation and therefore turnout, a system change is something, or keeping AMS or something like that is something that can be the basis of change. It should increase the number of people coming up into the Assembly. However, the wider piece about kind of like culture and making sure that these people aren't going to be there for one term, they might want to re-stand for election. I know in the UK that we have a big issue with women and minorities standing for one term and then pulling back because of various numbers of reasons, including harassment and other things. Those conversations need to come hand in hand. So whilst I'm saying, yes, it's a starting point, but there needs to be a wider discussion on top of that.
Okay, so I'm looking to my colleagues. Are there any further questions that you wish to ask? No. Okay, can I thank you for... No, I should give you an opportunity for any final submissions that you wish to make to us. Is there anything you think that you want just to push the panel or into considering for the next set of elections in terms of that, or are you content?
Just to push the point on voter ID, I didn't get around to mentioning it, but there were polls by Ipsos and the Electoral Commission that did say that people that didn't turn out for vote, 8% from the Ipsos polling in 2023 cited voter ID being the reason that they did not turn out. And I know that's the local elections outside of London, but if we're talking about turnout, that is something that we need to address as well.
Thank you.
Just very briefly to say that while I was arguing that for the election of the mayor, maybe first past the post makes a lot of sense because it's one person. In the case of the assembly, I will say that proportional representation is, of course, great, because I agree that it would encourage, or technically it should encourage, women and other minorities to stand for office. However, the issue that I want to raise is the importance to really have parties agreeing on having lists that are, not to put non-diverse candidates at the bottom of the list, and because otherwise nothing will really change, and it might potentially backfire.
Well, actually, to that point, it's interesting. I mean, this is not a proper comparison, I know, but it's interesting that the UK, which is overwhelmingly, not completely, used first-past-the-post voting systems, has done reasonably well by European standards in getting minorities into politics and up to high levels of politics. And I think there is a trade-off between, in proportional systems, the risk you give national parties a lot of power and local parties very much less power. And in the local party sense, it's certainly been possible through local government in Britain to get large numbers of people from minority backgrounds into local government. So I think there's a kind of trade-off there about what level of party decision-making decides who's to go forward as a candidate. One final point, though, looking forward to 2028, is that the government's committed to devolution. And if you look at the turnouts in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, where, in effect, devolution has meant that those governments have far more powers than the Mayor of London and GLA. They run all domestic policy and they have higher turnouts. And in Wales and Scotland, they've been going up. In Northern Ireland, they were always high. So I think it begs a question, if the serious devolution, would the Assembly, with this working group, expect turnout to go up to reflect more responsibility in the hands of the GLA?
Very interesting point. Thank you very much for your contributions this afternoon. We're going to go back and probably check the transcripts over, and there may well be a further issue where we might try to clarify with you. Likewise, if there's something as you leave this meeting you think, I wish I'd said that and put this across to them, please come back to us. And thank you for the evidence you've already submitted, but never mind just your contribution this afternoon. This is the last of our sessions, so we at this point will go away and consider what we've heard from the various parties. But I also want to thank your contribution, because we don't normally get an opportunity to do that. Academics, pressure groups in some ways are vital in terms of democratic participation, and the fact that you show an interest in our work, we're always grateful for, to be honest, because we are a small number and must remember that that actually our mission is to get a much more wider majority interested in some of the work because of the importance to their daily lives. So elections are important, outcomes of elections are more important. You would say that, but actually you contribute to that democratic process as much as any politician. So thank you very much for your work and the colleagues that you do across the country as well. So at that point, we're going to go away and deliberate. We probably are not going to commit ourselves to a timetable, but before the end of the year, hopefully sooner, we will be putting together a review of the elections that took place earlier in May. So that's the plan. That's what we're all committed to and that we will do, but thank you for your contribution to it. I now need to do some formal work. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the background to put in questions to the invited questions? Yep. There's no urgent business under any other business. Can I now consider this meeting closed? Thank you very much.
The home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.